This is where we are in the Amida Sutra, where we talked about the wrapping up the 6 directions of the Buddhas. And Shakyamuni Buddha say that all the Buddhas support this Amitabha. And that's where we left off last time, where we liked Buddhism for the right reason or the wrong reason, right? And that depends on our motive, because the right motive here is 正见, right? 真经, the right motive, and which is based on conditionality. When we have the right motive, right understanding, right seeing, that should be based on conditionality. And of course, in the right motive, there is no unskillfulness, meaning there is no selfish craving, there's no hatred, there's no jealousy. So when we do something and we don't have selfish craving, hatred, or jealousy, then we know, and that is based on conditionality, then we know that it is the right motive. And this is important because with the right motive, with the right intention, and when we have the right materials, then it can help us with the right method. Meaning that you have the key, but you have to be at the right door. And in order for you to unlock and open the door, if you have the wrong key but at the right door, then that doesn't work also. Meaning that your motive needs to be in line with materials that you are studying and the methods that can help you to apply those methods. So therefore, the emphasis is on the consistency between Dharma study and our secular life. Those two should be flowing in the same positive direction. And that's what we left up last time. So we want to focus on the consistency between how we live our life and how we study Buddhism. Because if there is inconsistencies, then there will be a tug of war. And therefore, that inconsistency will bring internal conflicts and will be very difficult for us to feel at ease. And that's why we can end up feeling miserable and confused. So should there be a bridge between our religious and secular aspects of life, then that will impact how we practice Buddhism. Meaning that our attitude in life will show up in our spiritual practice. We can change the environment, but it is more effective to change our attitude than to change the environment. If we cannot reconcile the conflicts, our internal conflicts between our religious life and the secular aspect of life, and we pursue religious life at the expense of the secular life, then we will encounter obstructions in our religious life. Meaning that if we cannot have a happy life and we are forcing ourselves to find happiness in Buddhism, then it will show up as unhappiness. It will show up as conflict. Because there are 2 ways that can impact our life. One is direct way and the other one is indirect way. Indirect way is when we live our life and it impacts our spirituality. The direct way is when we practice spirituality. Of course, that will have direct impact on our spirituality. So our spiritual life and religious studies should be pointing in the same direction. There should be no conflicts between our worldly life and its duties and our spiritual life and our religious studies. Those 2 should be pointing in the same direction. Otherwise, there will be a tug of war. Okay, so how a Buddhist lives his life should be consistent with his Buddhist study. So again, one is a direct impact, the other one is indirect impact. right? As we carry ourselves in a shopping mall or outside, it has dealing with people, it has indirect impact to our spirituality. So it does have some impact depending on how we carry out our lives. This constant tug of war here is because of the internal conflict. And this constant tug of war will make us disassociate ourselves from the transcendental principles. And even the sincere students cannot entirely withdraw themselves from the principles, meaning that without self-discipline and without proper guidance, it is very easy for us to be pulled by the worldly temptations. And that will only increase our selfish cravings and afflictions. And of course, the result is that we will move further and further away from the transcendental principles. And it is all because of the lack of principles and the lack of proper methods of studying the Dharma. So the practitioners lacking in common guiding principles will be to some extent disintegrated. As an illustration here is that just like a person clinging desperately to a rock midstream feels against his body the mighty rush of waters, which seeks to tear him from his refuge and whirl him to destruction. So when we are not consistent between how we live our lives and our religious study, and we're trying to find peace in our religious study, and when we have to face reality again, it is like we're holding onto this rock to prevent us from being blown away, from being swept away by the strong current of water. You can survive living with this integration a day or two, but not for a lifetime. So sooner or later, that constant tug of war, in that constant tug of war, something is going to give, right? And something is going to be torn apart because that pressure will continue to build up if it's not released. So one of the reasons for spiritual struggles is due to the misunderstanding of the principles. So when we live our lives and we're trying to find happiness in our spiritual study, but we don't have the proper understanding, it could negatively reinforce or impact our life. An example here is this author. He said that he was leading a group, and a woman in there was telling him that she was very delighted with Buddhist teaching, Anatman, right, doctrine, the no self doctrine, Vongya, Uwo. And that was the reason why she had converted herself to Buddhism. She said that there is no self, there is no soul, there is no I, no me, I'm not. And that's why she felt comfortable, I guess, with that teaching. She felt happy with that teaching, that there was nothing that existed. But after a while, she came to her conclusion that she was wrong. He said that I just discovered something in my meditation. Now I know why I like the no self doctrine. It is because I hate myself. I like to feel that I'm not there. I like to cancel myself out. It's just like an expression of my self-hatred. And she discovered that she had been wrong with this understanding. And so this person, because of that misunderstanding, that what she thought was something very delightful of Buddhist teaching, but in fact it was her ego, her self-hatred. Right? So with the wrong understanding and the wrong view of the principles of the no self, it can make us feel like everything is meaningless because nothing exists. And then eventually we will lose our motivation. And the worst is that it can make us feel very depressed. So in order to avoid the misunderstanding, we should ask ourselves, are we serious in our request for spiritual liberation? This author said that when he was in India, he had seen many people coming up to him saying that Swamiji is like Sanjishi Ting or like a guru. Swamiji, please tell me how I can become enlightened in this very life, right now, if possible. In the Pure Land Buddhism, a similar request would be, tell me how to migrate to Sukhavati right now, if possible. How can I migrate to the Western Pure Land immediately in this lifetime? The author says that such a request is highly unlikely to be serious. It is simply good religious form to ask this sort of question. The petitioners would be horrified if you really gave him the answer and expected him to follow your advice. So people ask for a teaching or a cure, but it is often the last thing that they want. And so it is very important to ask ourselves, what is it that we want? When we study Buddhism and we're seeking for spiritual liberation, do we know what that means? Because if we are presented with the actual answers, are we going to be able to handle the answer? Right? So do we know what we want? Do we know who we are? It's the essential questions to ask. Another story to illustrate this is in the Pure Land Buddhism, as you are aware, is one of the branches in Buddhism. It's very popular in Japan. Right there's a story about a devout old woman, follower of Pure Land Buddhism, and she wanted to be born in the Pure Land of Amitabha. So she in her mind that when she died, she did not want to be reborn in this wicked old world, corrupted world, and that she wanted to be born in the Sukhavati, the Western Pure Land, in a beautiful lotus flower, and she could sit there for ages upon ages listening to Amitabha preaching. So she wanted to die quickly and be reborn in this paradise. So her prayers and meditations had a certain urgency. So every morning in the temple, she would pray to the Amitabha in front of a statue very loudly, and to the infinite life Buddha, she said, "Oh Lord Buddha, please take me quickly. Please take me away from this wicked, corrupted world. I am so fed up with it. I just want to die and be reborn in your Pure Land. Please take me." So there was a certain monk, and he couldn't help to hearing her because she would pray very loud, and every morning she would be very prompt to be at a temple to pray for rebirth in Sukhavati. So the monk decided to test out her faith. One day, the monk was hiding behind the statue of Amitabha and waiting for her to come, because she would come every morning. And there she went again praying, "Please take me, escort me to the Western Pure Land." And she would pray very loud with tears running down her cheeks. And then behind the Buddha statue, the monk would yell out, "Yes, I shall take you now." And when she heard the Buddha's voice, she thought it was the Buddha answering her. And she let out a shriek and fled, wailing, "Won't the Buddha let me have my little joke?" So we should be clear in what we want. So that's the whole point of this story, is that do we know what we want? Because if we want spiritual liberation and we have to migrate from one place to another, are we willing to let go of what we have to achieve something better? Or are we so attached to what we have that we are afraid of letting go of something to achieve something better? Right? Usually, and you can see this in life, and that sometimes people are afraid to take risks. And it is not that they don't understand the risk, but because they are attached to what they have, and they're not willing to let go. And it is understandable in some cases. For example, you have a family, then of course you don't want to take the risk. You don't want to spend your savings on a business venture or to make a risky purchase, stock purchase, right? So because you have family obligations. and people are not willing to take risks is because they're attached to what they have and not willing to take the next step. So same thing when we practice Buddhism and we are taught of no self, altruism, and it is difficult sometimes to practice because in altruism we have to let go of ourselves, right? We have to let go of our ego, and it is very fearful to let go of our ego because we identify with our ego. So to let go of something that we're familiar with, it is very scary. And so when we have that, we cannot make advancement. But of course, I'm not saying we should be daredevils and just make a jump without understanding. We should take it step by step, but progressively advancing towards spiritual liberation. Okay. So with the right understanding of Buddhism, it will help us to minimize our internal conflicts. Otherwise, we'll be torn mentally, spiritually, like the example of the person clinging to the rock in midstream and fighting that current. Just like when we have problems in life and we trying to seek solace, peacefulness, joy in religious study, that's what's happening to us is we're trying to avoid life and trying to find happiness in religious study. And there will be conflict because life is pulling us in one direction, but we're pulling ourselves in another direction. And therefore this integration will result in mental and spiritual conflict. Right? Internal conflict here means this integration of energies. Our mental energies, our spiritual energies are being torn, are being pulled in different directions. And that's why we are disintegrated. We don't know what to do, right? We want to live our lives, but yet we also want spiritual liberation, but we're not very committed in spiritual liberation. And when we walk back in life, we feel the temptations and the pull of life the pressure that we don't like, and we run back to our religious studies, but then we cannot commit very well because we don't understand the principles thoroughly enough to be decisive about our directions, right? So to eliminate our internal conflicts, it is essential that we have this unifications of energies, right? We, one person, not multiple personalities, but one person's walking in the same direction, right? So integration of energies of one's life will lead to unshakable position. So in order to integrate our lives, we want something to hold on to. We want something solid, right? Something that's an unshakable rock of the Dharma. Something in spiritual studies that we want to have a foundation to depend on. And one of the things that we can do is to withdraw ourselves as much as we can from many profane activities. Of course, this is not to say that we should ignore life, but we should find a balance between our secular life and religious study. And how do we find that balance? We'll go into that now, right? So of course, we want, it depends on where you are in your religious study, you want to make sure that you are prepared, right? Everything that you do, you want to make sure you have preparation, just like planting a tree. You don't want to start planting when the soil is all dry and rocky, because no matter how much water you put in, how much care you put in, it's not going to grow, and it may not produce fruit because the ground is not suitable. So you want to prepare the ground, make sure that's fertile, and then when you sow the seed, it is very easy for it to grow. So it helps to lay that foundation and not just to jump right into religious study and hope that you find peace and find spiritual liberation. So one thing is to slowly transition from the secular life to a spiritual life without sacrificing your secular life. and that is to minimize the profane activities, things that are very mundane and things that are meaningless and things that don't really help you. Of course, one of the things is to participate in like Dharma assemblies or religious studies, right, in the religious spiritual communities to help us get acquainted. Because if you're force yourself to fit a mold, it's going to be very difficult to maintain it that way. Hope that makes sense so far. Yeah. Okay. And part of that, to make that transition, is to avoid activities that stimulate the lower mind. And what that means is that our consciousness is very complex. And you can divide your consciousness into 3 levels. One is a simple consciousness, and that is sense-based perception. And that's something that we have in common with animals. Being immersed in our sensations without awareness, that is simple consciousness. You just react because of survival of the fittest. Right? So that's something that we share with animals. And it is passive growth through normal biological evolution. For example, when a species evolves, that's biological evolution, and as the species comes up that food chain, it can be more secure, right? Like humans, we are like top of the food chain, so we don't have to worry about being eaten unless we're being careless. But we're at the top of the food chain because we have evolved there. So we don't have to do much in terms of protecting ourselves. That simple consciousness in that normal biological evolution will help us to grow. And then that passive growth is like from savagery to civilization. But at some point, that growth, that evolution will stop because it can only take us so far. And that's, in other words, if you just don't do anything, but it is very limited at some point. In fact, it may stop growing. It's like a child growing up. Your consciousness from that childhood growing up, it can grow very fast. But as you reach your adulthood, that growth, if you don't do anything, you stop learning, you stop going to school, it slows down, right? But as kids, they like to explore, they like to grow, right? Infants, they like to grow, they like to explore, they like to learn. But at some point, if you don't study, you don't put in the effort, then it stops growing. So that's simple consciousness, that level. In order to go beyond that level, you need to have this conscious effort in wanting to grow. So that's the next level, is self-consciousness. And that is the awareness of wanting to develop into an individual. We are individual and no longer with a group. And this individual is important because it stands out from the group. We are no longer a unit in a mass, but we are now an individual. And humans in Buddhism is the turning point between sliding back down in that the comfort of the simple consciousness, or transcend to the transcendental consciousness, the higher evolution. And so that's and this takes a lot, because this requires that you know who you are and what you want, and that when you feel that, let's say you have a good cause and you want to pursue, but everybody's telling you that don't be foolish, don't be putting your money there, don't be putting your time in that in such effort, because it's meaningless. But you feel deep in your heart that is something to pursue. So when you feel deep in your heart that is meaningful, then you will have this self-consciousness. You are becoming an individual and not just a unit and a mass. Does it make sense? Right? So self-consciousness here is that you know who you are and you know what you want. But that's not good enough, because it's still very limiting. The next level of consciousness is transcendental consciousness, where you start to see the world how it really is. and to see the conditioned existence and to rise above it. And this is called the higher evolution. And the higher evolution is a formidable proposition. And it will require all of our energy to pursue it. So self-consciousness is you can put in the effort, you don't mean to be different in the sense of not trying to be egoistic, but different because you have a purpose and you see your purpose and you see your calling and you pursue your calling regardless of what other people say, because to you that's meaningful, right? But to take one step further, to achieve that higher evolution, you will need all of your energy, your physical, your mental, your spiritual energies. So that's the difference. Does it make sense? Right. Okay. So what I'm trying to say here is that we want to avoid activities that stimulate the lower level consciousness. We want to involve ourselves with the higher level of consciousness, the transcendental consciousness, right? And we want to develop transcendental consciousness rather than reinforcing the animalistic or and simple consciousness. So when the practitioner thinks that he can devote an hour or two here and there a week, and that will be sufficient, and that when he's not so engaged, he will be free to spend his time in competitive games, with a trashy novel or under hypnotic influence of the latest popular film, then he will be making a very mistake, right? Because we're just fooling ourselves because we spend more time stimulating the lower level consciousness. So how can we expect to have the strength to have any kind of motivation towards the higher level of consciousness, right? So we want to seek spiritual liberation. We need to be a whole one person wanting to pursue that goal. Not sometimes we want it, sometimes we don't. Some days we're very motivated, and other days we just feel very lethargic about it. That's not going to take us anywhere, because we are being pulled in different directions. And when you are pulled in different directions, you become stagnant. You're not going anywhere. In fact, you will feel tired. You will feel drained because you're being pulled in different directions. So we want to be one whole person. We want to be here holy. We want to be holy. Etymologically, they're connected, right? The word whole and holiness. So we want to be spiritually whole, holiness, then we need to be our self, our one self, all the times and not just sometimes. And the request for spiritual wholeness requires the integration of our personalities. And for example, different personalities, sometimes we feel angry, sometimes we feel sad, excited, motivated, lazy. Those are different personalities pulling us in different directions. And we're not being holy. We're not being wholeness here. So, but before we find this to be very exciting, very stimulating of our principle to fully commit ourselves in this wholeness, we should do some reality check, right? We should make that preparation. So before we commit ourselves to being whole and give up all worldly joy, we need to make sure that we are building that foundation, doing the preparation. And the danger of being daredevil is that it could recoil. It could spring back to hurt us. And it could be quite dangerous to deprive ourselves from all comforts, right? Before we have started to get any real satisfaction from practicing Buddhism, we could well feel so bored and frustrated, and find life so blank and meaningless that we could be tempted to go to the opposite extreme, right? If you're trying to commit yourself to this spirituality, to pursue spiritual liberation. But before you lay that foundation, before you really enjoy the journey, but you want to commit yourself to it, then there is likelihood that you give up midway. You will never make it to the destination. So spiritual practice is not a daredevil type of activity, right? Because the result is that we could end up swinging from one extreme to the other one, right? And one extreme is to indulge in the world and ignore spirituality. The extreme is to indulge in spirituality and ignore the world. If we find ourselves in one extreme and we don't know why we're doing that, it is very possible that we will swing back to the other extreme. Right? So the encouragement here is that you must begin to enjoy being a Buddhist before you give up too much. Otherwise, you will associate being a Buddhist with a dull, dry, painful, difficult, joyless sort of existence. And this will make a bad impression of Buddhism in our head, that we will leave Buddhism with a very bad taste that is dull, meaningless, right? Painful, because we are forcing ourselves into something that we are not prepared for and we give up. And therefore, we will leave studying Buddhism with a very bad impression. And it will be a pity because we will lose our chance for spiritual liberation in this life, right? So a word of warning here that we should all consider is that this is not to be used as rationalizations for not giving up anything at all. It doesn't mean that we should continue to indulge and expect things to be fine, but we should be serious and earnest about ourselves, of our pursuit. Do we really want it? Do we know who we are? Do we know what we want? Right? It might be best to give up a few things and make things really uncomfortable for yourselves, and that may force the issues. So that it helps to give us a little nudge, right? To test ourselves, but not to go in the extreme, because if we're not prepared for it, like I said, it's gonna spring back and hit us in the head, right? So otherwise, you could remain stuck indefinitely, just being mentally occupied with the Dhamma, getting no real pleasure from it. And you could stay like that all your life. Some people, they jump right into spiritual study because they find dissatisfaction in life, but they're not making any commitment, any progress in spiritual study, but they've been burned in life, and therefore they don't want to go back, but they're not making any progress, and so they're stuck. Right? We don't want to be in that position. We want to make progress in whatever that we do, meaningful progress, not just like when you're rolling downhill, right? You're making progress, but you're not gonna be very happy when that like snowball effects where you're gonna hit the bottom. You want to make progress on the way up, not on the way down. So we want to make progress, and that requires integration. One person is moving forward, not different personalities trying to pull in different directions. Does it make sense? Right. So practicing Buddhism here should make us become happy Buddhists. Then we know that we're on the right path. Of course, being happy is not what Buddhism is about, but that is the natural byproduct of studying Buddhism properly. So it's important to maintain the balance, but slowly transitioning from mundane to transcendental, right? From coarse to fine. And what can be helpful in that transition is to understand that that worldly pleasures, although they may be very enjoyable, but they are just mediocre. Right? There's something else better. We should understand that there is something else better. And of course, we should understand what this means. But what I mean by something else better is that I don't mean there's something else for us to be had, to be appropriated. Otherwise, we're just transitioning from the worldly greed to spiritual greed. and it's still greed. Whether you are worldly greedy or spiritually greedy, it's still greed, and you haven't solved the problem. So when I say something better, is that the understanding of conditionality. When I say something better, is to acquire the ability to be skillful and to avoid mistakes. When you understand the law of conditionality and you make no mistakes, you have done nothing wrong. It's a very powerful feeling, and therefore you will avoid dissatisfaction and suffering. And knowing that you have the ability to do that is very powerful. So we should know that there is something higher than the worldly pleasures, but without feeling attached, without being greedy for it, right? And so when we say something better, I don't mean there's something out there tangible or that that would last forever. But the something better here is the understanding that we are equipped to make things better. Making things better is at our disposal, right? So to give you an example, a concrete example to drive this home is, for example, like the transition from feeling secure for having a large bank account to going beyond the need for money. It's wonderful to know that you have money. You have a lot of money. You have a big bank account, because you can go and buy anything. You can feel financially secure because you have a large bank account. But what's even better is that you have no fear for running out of money. Meaning that you never have the need for money ever again. There's no fear of it. Does it make sense? For another example is, let's say that you have friends who want to take care of you, and so let's say you're old, you're at your old age, and you're bedridden, and you want other people to take care of you, and there are people who take care of you. You want water, they bring you water. You want to go out to your garden, they'll put you in a wheelchair and they'll wheel you out to the garden. But that is not freedom compared to the strength that we have on our own to be able to walk, to be able to take care of ourselves. People might not take care of us, but we know how to take care of ourselves. It is much better, wouldn't you say, than to have people take care of you. So when I say something better here is that you have gone above the conditions of existence, where you no longer have the fear of running out of what is it that you need. So you're free from all fears and all selfish cravings. Does it make sense? Right? So it's not going from feeling secure with a large bank account to a even larger bank account. That's not what I mean by something better. I don't mean to trade one bank account for a bigger bank account, but true happiness comes from being free from the grip of egoistic desire. Does it make sense? There's no fear anymore, because if you have desire, there's fear. You want to have a large bank account, and once you have it, there is fear of losing it, right? So because it's egoistic. But happiness is that you have gone above the fear of losing. Does it make sense? All right, so that's what I mean here. So, okay. Sometimes mediocre satisfaction blocks the path of true satisfaction. And the good is the enemy of the best. And it is because of attachment and fear of losing what we currently have. Just like we mentioned earlier, you want to make progress, you have to leave what you have currently and achieve something better. Meaning, right, just like walking on the flight of stairs. You want to go from one floor to the next, you got to leave the first floor and go up to the next floor. But if you don't, you feel happy what you have, then you never be able, you never have the opportunity to achieve something that's better, right? So we must learn to ask ourselves what we really want. because very often what we think we want is not really our heart's desire. And we have gotten to the habit, and we're used to it. We think we cannot live without it, and we think we enjoy it. But in reality, there's no satisfaction when we have attained it. But if we stop and think about our experience, we often have to admit that we don't really enjoy the things we usually do. Right? You look at the nice car, you think it's wonderful to be driving that car, but once you have that car, it's mediocre. So Mr. Chan, our chairman, in the lecture, I believe yesterday, he mentioned about drinking coffee. A person who likes to drink coffee, it's not the coffee that makes him want to drink coffee, but the experience of drinking coffee, the pleasure of drinking coffee, or eating ice cream and whatnot. It's not the ice cream that makes you feel happy, joyful, but it's your experience in eating that ice cream. And the reason here is that it's not ice cream, because if you continue to eat ice cream, you get sick and tired of it, right? So ice cream is not the source of satisfaction, but it's your experience. So when you seek to eat the ice cream or drink that coffee again, it is because you want to relive that experience. So it's not a coffee, it's not the ice cream, but you want to relive that experience. And we often find that the next time that we eat ice cream or drink coffee, it's not the same. And so it's not the ice cream, it's not coffee that makes us happy, but the experience that we want to relive. Right? So if you are unhappy, you can go out on the town, though your perceptions, and pretend to be happy. That's one way. The other way is to have this awareness, to stay where you are, knowing that you are unhappy, but at least you have some idea where to look for true happiness, right? Instead of trying to occupy your mind by endlessly scrolling through your phones for the YouTube videos or whatnot, news feeds. Trying to occupy the mind, but to recognize that, we are unsatisfied. We're looking for something to feel that's unsatisfactoriness. There's something that's empty in our hearts. We want to feel it. And we're here we are meaninglessly, endlessly scrolling through our phones trying to find that happiness. But we should recognize it and find a way of how to fill that void. Instead of doing that, at the very least, we know that we're unhappy, and we know where to find how to fix the problem. And it might sound strange, but in a way that the unhappiness you feel is positive, because it's simply the discomfort you feel when you are no longer trying to enjoy evanescent satisfactions. Right? It's meaningful in the sense that it's motivating you to find something better. Right? So this feeling can be uncomfortable and can be confusing at first, but it won't last forever, because we have this determination to find resolution. And nothing is permanent, right? The situation that you're in is not permanent. And no matter how strong your feelings may be, no matter how sad you are, it won't be permanent. Or no matter how happy you are, it won't be permanent. It can change. So you might perhaps feel on a Saturday night when everyone in the world seems to be going out to have a good time, that resisting the pulling to join the social stream is somehow disintegrating. By losing touch with social world, you feel you are losing touch with your own energy. This is because there is within you something that is in conflict with your more creative energies that responds to that pull. So the worldly enjoyment is pulling us in one direction, and our spiritual energy is pulling us in a different, opposite direction. And when you surrender to the attraction, all that has happened is that one part of you has triumphed over the other with the help of outside forces. That certainly doesn't represent integration. You feel happier. You now going out on a party, you made up your mind, forget about religious study. I'm gonna go out and party. I feel better now, but that doesn't mean integration, right? You feel better, but it doesn't mean integration. You haven't resolved the conflict. You have just submerged it for the time being. You probably temporarily ended the tensions with you by yielding to the outside influence, right? So you feel better, but you haven't resolved the issue. It will come back to haunt you again, right? So in such case, the fruit of your cultivations are not all lost. Your efforts are not all lost. As long as you still have that thought, that desire to return to the transcendental path, you can leverage the law of impermanence. What this means is that under the law of impermanence, nothing lasts forever. The worldly influence and attraction cannot last forever. Your worldly enjoyment cannot give you the satisfaction forever. So that's what under the law impermanence is, things change. Happiness or sadness, things will change. So as long as you have this awareness and you do not give up, its grip on you will be weakened. And you will be able to break free from the worldly attraction to return to the transcendental path. Right? So that's the law of impermanence. Working towards in our advantage is that we can change it. It is not set in stone that you are sad forever or you are happy forever. If you are happy but you don't put in the criteria, you don't put in the effort to find something meaningful, then it's gonna be meaningless. Like the enjoyment that you have, the worldly enjoyment that you have, after a while becomes meaningless, right? So, but if we don't do that, but of course that is much better than being miserable, because being miserable, being depressed, you will lose your motivation, and it's very difficult to pick yourself out of that to advance. But in the state of happiness, it is much easier to change to spiritual pursuit. Right? You agree? Right? So it's much easier when you already have so much energy pulling you forward. You can change direction. But if it's depressing, then you have no energy, force to push you forward. So happiness is important because it's a source of motivation. So with the right view and the right method of study and the right method of practice, we should ask ourselves, why do we want to study Buddhism? Right? And if we can answer that question, that is the first step. The next step is to make sure that we have the materials to help us to pursue that question. And of course, the guidance from a guru will be very helpful. And so how do we find good right guidance? So in Kalama's Sutra, the Buddha gives us guidance of how to find good guidance. During the Buddha's time, a group called Kalamas, they attract, I guess, a lot of spiritual leaders to come to that town. And every leader had their own way of explaining what the truth was. And so that's caused the Kalamas to be very confused because they didn't know who to believe. And so the Kalamas, they were bewild by the disputes of these monks, claiming that they had the truth. So there was a dispute between these monks and the Brahmins. The Brahmins were the top rank of the on society, if you will. And so the Buddha said to the Kalamas, he said, do not go by hearsay, right? That's been handed down by others. And do not go by what other people say, or even authority of your traditional teachings. Do not go by reason, nor by inferring, nor by argument as to methods, nor from reflection on the approval of opinion, nor out of respect. Now, thinking that these monks here must be deferred to. So then the Buddha went on to explain. So what would be bad examples of bad teachings. He said, kalamas, when you know of yourselves, these teachings are not good, they are blameworthy, they are contemned by the wise. These teachings, when followed out and put in practice, conduce to loss and suffering. Then you should reject them. Right? Don't just blindly follow what people say, or some celebrities that they're not promoting such and such teaching, and you adore them, that you follow them. That's because it could lead to loss and suffering. The real import of this off-quote but much misunderstood passage should be carefully noted. So again, when we study this, we should understand why the Buddha said it this way, because this was not intended as a vindication of free thought, nor does it give carte blanche to rationalistic skepticism. Rationalism is in fact explicitly rejected. So the kalamas, they were confused by the impossibility of reconciling the claims made on the behalf of one method of reaching the goal with the claims made on behalf of the other methods. So there was a dispute and they were just confused. All the rival teachers could not be speaking the truth. If one was right, the others must be wrong. Right? So the Buddha's reply is not an invitation to question the existence of a transcendental state. So we shouldn't take the scripture and say, hey, I don't trust the Buddha now. That's not what it means. Nor an encouragement to doubt whether the realization of such state is within the reach of human effort. Right? We start doubting, is it even possible for me to reach enlightenment? That's not what is meant here. The reason is because in the Sutra of 42 chapters, the Buddha says, rely not upon your own will. Your own will is not trustworthy. Guard yourselves against sensualism, for it surely leads to the path of evil. Your own will become trustworthy only when you have attained arhatship. Right? So until we have reached that sagehood, we should not so freely judging and start doubting. We should follow reliable sources and trustworthy gurus to help us. Right? So even though the Buddha is saying, don't trust anything, anybody, make sure that it makes sense, that it leads to goodness. But at the same time, he's not saying start doubting that you have the ability to achieve enlightenment. It simply affirms that we are to decide between the rival claims of religious teachings, firstly, on the basis of their result as reviewed in our experience, and secondly, in accordance with testimony of the wise. So we read the sutras and it makes sense. It makes sense, and when we apply it, we start to reap benefits. Right? So when we read a sutra, it makes sense to us, and we see those who practice, they live a happy life and meaningful life. And then when we start to apply it, we feel happy and meaningful. So we know it's useful, right? So we can start to apply more and more of it. The wise do not indulge in fame and fortunes and acrimonious arguments, right? During the Buddhist day, within the Sangha, even within the Sangha, there were monks interpreting the Buddha's teaching in different ways. And so the foster mother of Gautama, which is the Buddha, she got confused, say, Buddha, how should I want to learn from the monks, your disciples, but I'm hearing different interpretations. So how should I accept, how should I understand the teachings, your teaching? I want to hear from you. How should I understand your teaching? The Buddha says, if you learn a teaching, it leads you to have the ability to dwell alone, solitary, zealous, ardent, and resolved, in much more positive terms, of course, in a more definitely than it's definitely Buddhism. We should understand that this in a more positive term. When he said that when you learn Buddhism, it should make you to be alone. We should understand spiritually and not psychologically. The Buddha is not telling Buddhists to run away into the woods to be alone and ignore life, right? But in our hearts, we should be comfortable being in our own skin, right? Be comfortable with who we are, and we can still be zealous and diligent. But when we are by ourselves, we can still be diligent and be zealous. Then we know that's our own efforts. But if you're in a spiritual community and everybody's happy and you feel happy, then you don't know whether you're being truly happy because you're being affected by the environment. But if you're by yourself and you feel happy, then you know that the effort is yours. You're still being diligent, then you know that your effort is yours. So we should use aloneness as a test, not as a way of life. Does it make sense? Right? Sometimes we have to be alone in order to understand how much we have progressed. It's not meant for us to be seclusive and to ignore life, right? So being alone is a good test, and it's not meant for us to run away from life. It's a means to an end, it's not an end to itself. Does it make sense? Right? So what are the examples of bad teachings? The Buddha says, of whatsoever teachings, these doctrines conduce to passions, not dispassion, bondage, not to detachment, to increase of worldly gains, not to decrease of them, to covetousness, not to frugality, to discontent, not to content, to company, not solitude, to sluggishness, not energy, to delight in evil, not delight in good. Of such teaching, thou mayest with certainty affirm that this is not the norm of Buddhism. This is not Buddhism. The author translates as norm, but this is not Buddhism. This is not the discipline. This is not the master's message. Okay, and what are the good teachings? The good teaching should be the opposite that I have told you. So we should, all right, of such teaching, certainly it would be the norm. Buddhism would be disciplined, and this is the master's message, right? So the right path leads us to skillfulness, purity of the mind, less greed, less anger, less confusion, but more diligent, more positive. Does it make sense? Right? So and that allows us to navigate the world without failures. Things that we've learned, and we can navigate the world without failures. There are people who are smart, but they're not wise, because they can still make mistakes. Right? They can still be corrupted. They may have high credentials, many credentials, but it doesn't mean that they're wise, right? So when we learn something and we can maintain our skillfulness, our purity of the mind, then we know that we have gained something there that's very valuable, right? So be balanced and be happy. So what are some of the practical guidelines to help us maintain a balanced life? Right? And how to make sure that our efforts are not extreme and that we will not be on the wrong path. So I'll share this with you. So the problem seems to be that we make the wrong kind of effort. And this happens when we try to appropriate a higher experience as something to be incorporated into our existing being. So we take something that we aspire to achieve, and we're trying to force it into our life. And that's going to create a problem. So what you should be doing is incorporating your existing being into the experience in such a way that your existing being is transformed. So we want to take our aspiration and transform ourselves and not to force fit into our existing. Does it make sense? This effort, which is really just willful exertion, is an attempt to retain the experience within the existing structure of your being without allowing it to change you. So it's just like a square peg in a round hole. You're trying to force it to fit, and something's going to shatter, right? Something's going to break. So when you try to force something that doesn't fit into something that's completely different, then something's going to give, something's going to break. Right? We want spiritual liberation, but we are not prepared for it. And we're trying to force it in our lives. We're going to make it very difficult for ourselves. Until enlightenment is attained, there will always be a conflict between appropriating and experiencing, between incorporating and surrendering. It is not good thinking that all effort is willful effort and therefore to be avoided. So it doesn't mean that we should give up. We should not do anything about it. We should give a little bit of nudge to force ourselves, and to round this peg a little bit, right? Not just hammer into the round hole, but try to put some effort to round it up a little bit, and it'll fit perfectly, right? So without morality and responsibility, freedom will lead to complacence, indulgence, and it will reduce one's merits and value, and it will lead to suffering. And just like living in luxury by financing it, right? It will lead to bankruptcy. So spiritual freedom is spiritual richness, right? Financing our merits, meaning you want to have a meditative joy without putting in the effort to make the preparation, you are spiritually financing that meditative bliss. It will lead to spiritual bankruptcy. Does that make sense? On one side, when we're financing our worldly riches, we are overflowing with financial debt. On the other hand, when we try to have the meditative bliss, but we don't have the criteria to earn the meditative bliss, then we are all overflowing ourselves with negative emotions. We will feel horrible about it when things come to shove. So the solution to the problem of willfulness is not simply to take things easy, but to know who we are, what we want, and to make the preparation. So for example, trying to live a carefree life without first having fulfilled our own obligations. That is an example of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Something is going to break, right? Or another example is to achieve a state of no thought, meaning they just want to be blank. They don't want to think about anything, no skillfulness, no unskillfulness whatsoever, without first having cultivated right contemplation. I mean, you're forcing your aspiration into your existing being. So right contemplation here on the right, the Eightfold Path, what this means is that with right contemplation, all your thinking is skillful. So before we even try to stop thinking, we have to practice right contemplation. Of course, no thinking here doesn't mean no evil, unskillful thinking. Not no thinking like you're a piece of wood. That's not what it means. Right? So being unskillful is a state of delusion, not knowing what's wrong, what's right. But being skillful is to be able to differentiate between what's wrong and what's right. And being pure is the next level. So they misunderstand the no thought for the impurity. What we're trying to achieve is not a state of no thought, but a state of purity. It goes beyond skillful and unskillful. Does it make sense? Right? Another example is to practice, they want to practice right meditation without preparing the first 7 elements of the Eightfold Path. They want to live in spiritual richness. They want to live in spiritual richness, but they still have craving because they have not studied the first 7 elements of the Eightfold Path, right? Right view, right contemplation, right speech, karma, right livelihood, right diligence. Those things help us to prepare for right meditation. Another example is they want to have the ability to be alone, to avoid distractions so that they can achieve enlightenment quickly without maturing their social skills and showing loving kindness and care towards others. Right? They want to be seclusive. They want to be excluded from the world so that they can achieve enlightenment, but they have not shown the ability to show loving kindness. So that is trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Something is going to break. Another example is they want to see everything as empty, no self, without first understanding the law of conditionality. Because otherwise it will lead to what happens to this is that a person likes to claim that everything is empty, nothing exists. And then when he says that to his friends, for example, and his friend slaps him in the face and he gets upset, then say, "Why do you hit me?" "Well, I thought you said everything was empty, nothing existed." All right. So the fact that he responded, meaning that he only learned of the principle, but he didn't know how to apply the principle. Does that make sense? Right? So before we can achieve all these things here, we want a carefree life, we want to have meditative bliss, we want to make progress towards enlightenment, we want to achieve this state of no self, then we need to have first fulfill our responsibilities, right? Cultivate merits, right? Follow the Eightfold Path, and develop the social skills to interact with people, to serve people, right? To show loving kindness and care towards other people. When people challenge you, you've been trying to kind to them, you can overcome your ego, and you still you don't give up. You don't lose your motivation to continue on your journey. Then you deserve to be on that journey. Does it make sense? So trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, it's going to be very painful, right? So what does that mean then? Then what do we do, and why is it so painful? Why is there imbalance in one's life? Well, it may be that the effort you make is not distributed over a broad enough spectrum of interest, so that your spiritual life becomes rather one-sided, and you lose your motivation. For example, if you're at work, you think about spirituality practice, but when you're in spiritual community, you're not dedicated, so you're being imbalanced. So we should do what we need to do. Practicing mindfulness doesn't mean that we should be at a temple or way place, but practicing mindfulness is anywhere. When you're at work, you put in 100% of your efforts to do your work, to complete your work. And when you're in a spiritual community or at home, you do what is necessary to those around you, right? To bring happiness to those around you. So it's not that you've been placing too much stress on your effort, but that the effort is not distributed sufficiently widely. When we put in a lot of effort, it doesn't, and we're not making progress. It's not that we are not putting in effort, but we're not applying it right. Ways to resolve this: you schedule your activities accordingly, right? If you need to meditate, set aside some time to meditate. And during that meditation, you don't want to be disturbed, that's fine. And at other times where you need to work, you need to attend to the needs of your family, then you have time to do that. You fulfill your responsibilities, right? You're not being one-sided, but you're being evenly distributed. Okay? So schedule your activities. Don't start any one of them to avoid being off balance. So it takes some skillfulness. But of course, we should be honest with ourselves that we are putting in the right efforts and not giving ourselves excuses or rationalize that, oh, I'm being mindful and here you are doing something that's not very skillful. So how do we do that? So the next few minutes before we end here, I'd like to share this with you, is that as we're being flexible to accommodate the world, to find that balance, that we should make sure that we're not fooling ourselves, but rather we are being skillful. So how can we be skillful? And this leads us to skillful means. It's a terminology that often used in Buddhism. And skillful means here has a broad meaning than simply acting in a way that encourages people to be open with you. It can even include and appear to be unethical, but in fact highly ethical on account of understanding motivation. So we should understand this a little bit, because otherwise we can be unskillful when we are being unskillful, and when we can be unethical when we're trying to be unskillful. When we're being skillful, it's different from bodhisattvas being skillful. When we're being skillful, our level of skillfulness is different from theirs, because you have to take into account of what third parties might think of what you're doing, right? What makes apayakasaya skillful is its effect on the person towards whom it is directed. If it fulfills the purpose in an apparently unethical manner, it is more skillful than ever. But we should understand this before we say, okay, I can do whatever I want because I think it's skillful. Bodhisattvas take into account all the sentient beings in that environment. So he does have to consider the possible effects of his skillful means on the observers around him. Right? Having done this, he may decide to go ahead with the apparently unethical action for the benefit of the person towards whom it is directed. Through his supernormal powers, he will be able to make his action invisible to those who are not directly involved with it. So that's the difference, okay? When we do something unethical and we think that's skillful, well, and we don't have supernatural abilities, we don't have the wisdom, then it is unethical, right? So if we don't have supernatural powers, we should avoid unethical behavior. Maybe when they read this, they rationalize because they may have seen in the White Lotus Sutra, there's a very famous parable of the burning house where the Buddha's promised his children that he would give him each toy of their desires, right? A cart of their desire. But when they got out, there was only one cart, the white ox cart, very powerful ox, right? But it was well adorned. So they say, well, the Buddha lie in a sense to achieve his means. Well, we should not jump to conclusion yet. The Buddha appears to feel he has to justify his action in promising the children 3 different kinds of cart when he knew that he was only going to give them one kind. He has to explain that he has not really told a lie. The reason why this is because at that time, when they wrote down the scriptures, the White Lotus, there was not such a term called upayakasaya, skillful means. This skillful means, this word, this terminology here did not exist during that time. But the Buddha appears very conscious of the fact that his skillful means could be regarded as such ordinary trickery. But eventually, that skillful means to mean skillful means in a purely spiritual sense. Upaya kausaya is a skillful mean in spiritual terms. So if you give somebody, let's say that you say, if you leave this room, go outside, I'll give you a bag of candy, a bag of sweets. But then you end up giving everyone 2 bags of candy. You're not failing to keep your promise, right? You have overachieved, you can say. So technically you have told a lie, but ethically you're not being unethical about it. Does it make sense? Right? So because you have given more than what you promised, and certainly this message is not to be understood as condoning lies, even in a good cause, right? So we should understand the meanings of the sutras. Sometimes people use the term skillful means as rationalization for unskillful behavior. And that's not what we're talking about. Sometimes people use skillful means to uncover their own weaknesses as a cover-up. For instance, in the course of discussions, you become very angry with somebody and you lose your temper. You may say afterwards, I'm sure it did him good, so I guess that was just my skillful means. Well, you're just fooling yourselves, right? So we should be careful not to use expressions, skillful means, as a cover-up, as a trickery behavior. But we should be honest with ourselves. Yes, I was angry, that was not right. I will try to fix it. I'll try to be better next time. It's more acceptable than to say, well, that was meant to teach him a lesson. So very often disciples rationalize the dubious activities of their spiritual teachers in this way and exist on regarding questionable behavior on the part of the so-called teachers as being his skillful means, right? They do this because they need to keep up with their faith in their teachers. Imagine you've been following a teacher for 20 years, 30 years, and then one day you find out that he's not as ethical as you thought. It could be very shattering, right? You lose all your faith. For some people, they couldn't bear that, so they just accept and say, well, it must be his skillful means, right? So we don't want to be caught in that. So a bodhisattva is simply himself. On the other hand, he doesn't have to behave in any special way. So he doesn't pretend to be ordinary. He is ordinary, but at the same time, he is a bodhisattva. So he can be himself, and he communicate genuinely in his unself-conscious way. So the bodhisattva does not use special techniques. It's not like he's using some sort of a trick up his sleeve in an attempt to win friends and influence people, right, in a rather sleek and artificial way. So skillful means here is essentially a matter of being able to be with people, of empathizing with them, encourage them to be open with you and to you. And this is why Mahayana attaches great importance to skillful means. Right? So at the same time, we're trying to be true to ourselves, and we're not fooling anybody. We shouldn't use skillful means as a cover-up for our own weaknesses. So in trying to achieve a balanced life, to maintain the motivation for spiritual progress, we should be skillful. We should be honest with ourselves without trying to fool ourselves or others. Okay? Any comments? Okay. All right, let's wrap this up here. So to avoid misunderstanding of Buddhism, we should rely on trustworthy sources and reliable gurus. When we like Buddhism, we should like Buddhism for the right reason and not for the wrong reason. The wrong reason is to have misunderstanding, and you're just trying to inflate your ego. You're trying to push your propaganda. Right motivation is important, and then we need to have right materials of study, right methods of practice, and study with a guru. And we should maintain consistency between a Dhamma study and our secular life. Right? There should not be a conflict. We should be one person moving in one direction. Right? One's capacity for understanding the truth is determined by the integrity of his character and how he lives his life. Right? For example, we study about compassion, loving kindness. How much we understand that concept depends on how we practice those concepts. Living an integrated life will help us to avoid this tug of war between reality and spirituality. Right? The Dhamma study should make us more compassionate, more wise, and more joyful. So when we know the good effects of those of our efforts. Buddhism is not just about obtaining joy, but it should help us to be courageous to overcome difficulties, not to run away from life, not to run away from challenges, difficulties, but to be equipped to lay the foundation so that we can resolve those difficulties. Right? So maintain a balanced lifestyle. Whether you're out in the world or you're in your religious studies, maintain that balance. Right? And be joyful in knowing that you are equipped to resolve difficulties. Right? So in your practice, in your study, be skillful, be balanced, be happy, and be helpful. Right? All right, any other comments? All right, great. We will end this here, and we will meet again in, let's say, we meet a couple times a week. The first week and the third week, so the next time that we meet will be November 7th. So you have a little break there. Okay, let's do merit dedication. If you could please join me, join your palms together, we recite. May the merits and virtues accrued today adorn the Buddha Pure Lands, repay 4 types of kindness above, and aid those suffering in the paths below. May those who see and hear of this bring forth the resolve for the Bodhi mind. When this retribution body is complete, together we shall meet in the land of ultimate bliss. If you could please rise and we bow to the Buddha 3 times to show our respect. First bow, second bow, and third bow. Amida. Please stay back for lunch.